Tariffs. You hear that word all the time, right? It's constantly in the news. You remember the headlines about steel tariffs, the back and forth with China. The arguments get really passionate, and they almost always seem to circle back to one very simple idea. And that's the big question, isn't it? The conventional wisdom, the story we're often told, is that, yeah, it absolutely can. The logic on the surface feels really intuitive. It just kind of makes sense. I mean, think about it. If you slap a tax on imported cars, well, people are probably going to take a second look at the cars made right here at home. And that should mean more jobs at the local factory, a nice boost for the economy. You know the story. It's that classic protectionist promise. Simple, direct, and sounds pretty powerful. Okay, but this is where the story gets really, really interesting and takes a huge, unexpected turn. It turns out that the actual effect of a tariff might have very little to do with the tax itself and everything to do with how this other incredibly powerful player, the central bank, decides to react. So let's just quickly break down that conventional wisdom. The whole idea hinges on a concept that economists like to call the expenditure switching effect. The goal is simple: make foreign stuff more expensive, and we'll all switch our spending from their goods to our goods. And this really is the core idea. You hike the price of French wine, and maybe people start buying more Californian wine instead. You tax German steel, and American factories start buying American steel. In theory, that big switch in spending should light a fire under the domestic economy. But, and this is a huge but, that tariff doesn't just exist in a bubble. And this brings us to the real main character of our story, the central bank. You see, a tariff is, by its very nature, inflationary. It directly makes imported stuff more expensive. This puts the central bank, whose number one job is often to keep inflation under control, in a super tricky spot. And to really get their dilemma, we need to understand what kind of inflation they're even looking at. Now, this right here is such a crucial distinction. Think of the CPI as the price of your entire shopping cart. It's got everything in it: the apples grown down the road and the smartphone that was imported from overseas. A tariff hits that smartphone and boom, your whole cart gets more expensive. CPI inflation goes up. But the PPI? That's just the price at the local factory gate. It only cares about domestic stuff, so it doesn't get directly hit by a tax on imports. And that difference? Well, it changes everything. So if there's one key takeaway, it's this: the real economic impact of a tariff isn't decided when the politicians pass the law. It's decided when the central bank chooses how to respond to the inflation that tariff just created. And that response, that's the whole ballgame. So let's actually play this out. Using the economic models from our source material, we can basically explore 3 different realities. In each one, the exact same tariff gets put in place, but because the central bank has a different policy, the economic outcome is wildly different. Okay, first up, a world where the central bank only cares about PPI inflation, the price of stuff made here. If you look at the top left graph, that green line represents economic output. See that? There's a little upward bump. Because the tariff doesn't directly hit domestic prices, the bank doesn't really see a reason to panic. It basically shrugs off the higher price of imports, keeps interest rates steady, and lets that little expenditure switching effect give the economy a tiny temporary boost. Now let's check out the second world. Here, the central bank's only job is to keep the currency's exchange rate totally fixed. By stopping the currency from getting stronger, which is what would normally happen after a tariff, the bank makes domestic goods look even cheaper to the rest of the world. And as you can see from that red line on the top left, this just supercharges the whole protectionist effect. You get a much bigger economic boom. But there's always a catch, right? Look at the red line in the middle graph. You get a huge spike in inflation. And now for the big one, the real stunner. In the third world, which is the one that looks most like our own, where central banks target that overall shopping cart inflation, the CPI, that same 20% tariff doesn't cause a boom. It causes a bust, a deep and immediate recession. Just look at that blue line on the top left graph. Economic output just falls off a cliff. And we are not talking about a little blip. The model shows an initial drop in output of almost 6%. That is a massive contraction, all triggered by the very policy that was supposed to help the economy. So what in the world is going on here?
This slide lays out the whole disastrous chain of events perfectly. The tariff hits, your total shopping cart, the CPI, gets more expensive. The central bank sees this inflation spike and, doing what it's supposed to do, it slams on the monetary brakes. It jacks up interest rates. And that makes it more expensive for everybody to borrow money and spend, for families to get a mortgage, for a business to expand. The central bank's reaction to fight the tariffs inflation ends up completely crushing the domestic economy. The cure is so much worse than the disease. So you might be wondering, does this logic hold up for other kinds of tariffs? Like, what happens if we tax the stuff we sell to other countries, or if tariffs hit the parts our own factories need? Let's take a look. When another country puts tariffs on our stuff, well, that's always going to be bad for our economy. But what's so fascinating here is that the central bank's best strategy completely flips. Now, the least damaging thing to do is target that domestic PPI and just let the currency weaken, which you can see in that green line. And the worst possible thing to do, peg the exchange rate. That red line shows it just magnifies the economic pain. It just reinforces that core idea. The choice of monetary policy is everything.
And what if the tariffs are on, say, the microchips that our factories need to build cars? Well, that's a direct blow to the supply side of the economy, and no surprise, it makes the contraction worse under every single policy. You can see how all the lines trend down. But even in this scenario, the basic ranking doesn't change. The most damaging, the most recessionary policy is still the most common one, targeting that overall CPI inflation, shown by that deeply dipping blue line. Okay, let's bring this all home. What this whole analysis really shows is that when we hear politicians and experts arguing about tariffs, they are almost always missing the most important piece of the puzzle. See, the real question isn't just, should we have a tariff or not? It's, okay, if we have a tariff, what do we actually want our central bank to do about it? Do we want it to ignore the inflation on imported stuff to try and protect jobs at home? Or do we want it to defend the value of our money, even if it means kicking off a recession? The tariff itself forces us to make that choice. And this quote from the source paper just says it all perfectly. A strict focus on that shopping cart CPI inflation causes the central bank to overreact. It's like it's attacking the symptom, higher prices on imports, with a tool so powerful it ends up hurting the entire patient, the domestic economy itself. So in the end, we're left with this really fundamental question. A tariff doesn't just tax things at the border. It puts the institution that manages our entire economy in a bind. In a world where our lives are filled with products from every corner of the planet, what should a central bank's priority really be? The factory down the street, or the total cost of everything you buy? The answer to that question might be way more important than any tariff could ever be.